Wonderful. Welcome to week one of Critical Neuroscience, the Mind-Body Connection. Today we will discuss a brief overview of the topics in the first chapter of the textbook, and I will also talk a little bit about how to navigate the somewhat complex background of the system we will be utilizing this semester. So one of the things that I would like students to familiarize with is, believe it or not, social media. Now, a huge part of this course will be navigating in the best, most scientifically accurate and proper way the complexities, the difficulties, and the challenges of analyzing, promoting, and even defending science in the social media realm. So in order to do this, I would like to ask you a personal favor. In this course, we will have the opportunity to test our knowledge through quizzes, reading assignments, as well as some practical assignments beyond tests that will involve some direct connection and communication using social media. One of such places will be the place that we find ourselves in the ether. So we will utilizing YouTube to understand certain topics, analyze them, criticize them, and also understanding the philosophical background behind each of the perspective that each topic will present. Now, I do understand that asking students to be part of a social media conversation as part of a course can be, in the best case scenario, mildly intimidating if you are shy, or outright difficult, and it might even present some ethical concerns, such as, well, I don't want to share my personal opinion publicly as part of a course. I don't want my identity and a name to be recognized, and I completely understand that. So I would like to encourage this activity, but if any of you don't feel comfortable making posts, public posts, or comments on YouTube, then I will understand. Please communicate with me via email. The main reason why I would like to utilize social media, particularly YouTube, is because so much of what we can find on the internet, it's not really scientifically based. It is very politicized, it is very biased, and now I don't want to sound naive. I do understand that any topic, particularly those topics that have to do with human identity, with the mind-body problem, with the very existence of us, animals, but specifically human beings, can be triggering to some. It can elicit some negative emotions. But in order to navigate such complexity, to promote science, to promote a much better understanding and even more nurturing understanding of what we are, I think this will be the great platform. What does it mean? Well, it means that each week you will have the opportunity to watch a video lecture, and you will also have the opportunity to post, criticize, comment, or simply share your thoughts with the rest of the class as part of a YouTube conversation. Now, you could set up your own YouTube account. You can also use your Gmail, Google account, and then utilize that to then access YouTube for your comments. But again, for the very reason that we just discussed in terms of privacy and feeling comfortable in doing that, if you would prefer to utilize an alias, or in other words, a different name than your own for the purpose of posting public comments, this would be definitely allowed. Please let me know via private email, the email that is posted on the system, that this is an option that you would like to choose so that we can have this type of conversation. One exception to this rule will be the introduction. The very first discussion we'll have this semester will be a discussion about professor and students introduction, self-presentation, and I will certainly not ask you to disclose any personal information on the ether publicly. So in order to do the discussion, we will utilize Blackboard as a system. Wonderful. Now, since we took care of the basic background and how to navigate the course structure, social media elements, and by the way, you will find more information in that regard on Module 1, I would like to start with the first topic for this semester, which will be a general introduction of the textbook. Now, in the next video, you will see a general overview of the philosophical literary reason as to why the textbook was written in the first place. So I recommend you check out that video for that specific reason. But today I would like to take a look at neuroscience in general. So let's begin with an overview, a general introduction. Now, the textbook started with a scientific re-examination of the mind-body problem is the subtitle of this study on critical neuroscience. It presents a very difficult task, a struggle many scientists and philosophers have been dealing with since time immemorial. Is there anything that can be said about such an incredibly complex topic, anything at all, which can be added to the conversation? Our main goal is to present a brief summary of the most important theories and experimental studies conducted so far on the correlation between mind and body. So as you can say, this would be an attempt, a human-based philosophical attempt to understand such complexity, a complexity that really becomes one of the best descriptors of who we are as human beings. Are we our mind? Are we our bodies? And by our body, do we mean our brain? And by our mind, do we mean our spirit, our soul? Now, those are existential questions that are very intriguing and define the line of perspective that this textbook is taking. Okay, so what do we mean by critical neuroscience? Well, there are two main aspects of this adjective, critical. One is the clinical perspective, and the other one is the more philosophical perspective. So let's take a look at the textbook again. Critical neuroscience has a double balance. It is critical in the epistemological sense of providing a criticism of the assumption, methods, methodologies, theories, techniques, and technology, and observation, interpretation of results in neuroscientific research. So as you can tell, this will be the evidence-based perspective we use in everyday science, in laboratory science, and of course, in those sciences that are mainly focused on the amelioration, improvement of human well-being. For instance, medicine and psychology. But it's also critical in the sense of applied and applicable to critical, clinical, medical, and philosophical existential situations. In other words, we are talking about a critical situation or emergency that is both situated in a social sense, anthropological sense, but also in a historical sense or philosophical sense, and in regard to embodied cognition, and truly emergent, from the Latin ex mergere. As we stated, some crucial elements in this analysis have already been presented in other works. I have provided a general overview of recommended texts at the bottom of the syllabus. Please take a look at those. But I want to make sure that all students have the opportunity to review the most important concepts presented therein by virtue of taking a look at each week's lecture. So in other words, you do not have to purchase other textbooks or other materials for this course. Everything will be provided as part of each week module. So every time we talk about neuroscience, we also talk about perception. What does it mean to be human? How do we know what we know? Now, general disclaimer here, this is not a course in philosophy or history of philosophy, so there will be certain areas that if you are interested warrant a much more in-depth examination. But from the perspective of what it means to be human, neuroscience has a lot to say. The concept of primacy of perception is part of scientific philosophical debate on consciousness under the framework of existence over essence, thus presenting themes akin to the ones found in existentialism or matter over mind, albeit with possible subjectivity over objectivity. What does it mean? Well, it's the usual debate of, or I dare to say, against postmodernism. A debate that is predicated upon the assumption that there should be something like a universal knowledge. By universal knowledge, we do not necessarily mean a knowledge that is accessible by anybody regardless of their training. This type of knowledge is an in-depth knowledge that might be accessible only to specialists in every field, but the assumption is that anybody with proper training would be able to access such knowledge. Against this perspective, you might find a variety of criticism, very often under the big umbrella of postmodernist philosophy, for which I would recommend you to do some more work to find out who these postmodernist authors are, or postmodernist reductionists, postmodernist deconstructivists, etc., etc. And you can start from the background of postmodernism, also in a social sense. You can start from Camus, and you can start from Sartre and Derrida, and so on and so forth, all the way to Foucault. But the idea is this: how can we use critical neuroscience, or neuroscience in general, to better understand who we are? And how do we know when we reach that universal knowledge that we can then share for the amelioration and improvement of well-being? Let's see what the book recommends. There is a focus on this subjectivity, because we as human beings are the ones that will analyze and be analyzed in this process. So in other words, there's this double hermeneutics, Anthony Giddens would term as, that makes us both the observed item as well as the observing scientist. And that makes things even more complicated, because neuroscience, it's a field, again, at the intersection between medical sciences, hard sciences like biology, for instance, physics, as well as a more non-directly applied science, such as theoretical mathematics, for instance, never mentioning the focus on philosophy. So we become the center of the attention of such focus. You could even say that in this regard, we are not different than finding ourselves in the eye of another person, and then thinking about philosophers such the otherness that you can find in the sense of Cartesian dualism, all the way to more modern philosophers. And by more modern philosophers, I'm thinking, for instance, about Levinas, Emmanuel Levinas. And again, the concept of the other is otherness, the other than me. So that I am a specular image of the person in front of me. The person in front of me gives me more information about who I am. And also from a neurological standpoint, this is consistent with discoveries in the area of mirror neurons. I do understand better about myself, and also I understand my abilities, my skills, including motor skills, by virtue of observation, by understanding myself through the eyes of another person. All right, so now that we discussed those basic premises, let's try to understand the logical sequence upon which those premises are constructed. So, are we our mind, or are we our matter? Now, this is one of the initial conversation that we will have in this semester, but of course, I will discuss this topic much more in depth when we will really discuss critical neuroscience as a field, because this course, it's called Critical Neuroscience, the mind-body connection, which is another version of the mind-body problem, we could say. But critical neuroscience is an emerging field as well, and it's something that I really want students to be mindful of. It's a new field that represents not only a new way of looking at things, a new way to look at different subfields of neuroscience, but an entirely new academic field in its own. It's all right in its own capacity to deliver, discover, and promote science. And therefore, we will discuss the mind versus matter, mind versus brain, where versus is not against, but it's a comparison, it's a face-to-face, it's a mirroring experience in that week when we talk about critical neuroscience. But let's begin by understanding what do we mean by mind versus matter. Well, for the sake of this brief introductory conversation, think of mind versus matter as one of the many dualistic possibilities in philosophy. When you think about dualism, of course, the first, at least in the West, the first name that comes to mind is René Descartes, or Cartesius, the Cartesian dualism, Cartesian philosophy, and the separation between mind and body, as in the body in a mechanistic sense, not too different from what Galileo Galilei had discussed, or what the primary Renaissance humanistic mechanistic perspective of the body was. So the body as a machine that should be therefore analyzed as such. Think about names such as Marcello Malpighi, for instance. And on the opposite side, anything that is not matter-based, anything that is transcendental by definition. Now, at this stage, I wouldn't like to analyze too much the difference between transcendent and transcendental, and venture into the analysis of certain philosophical works, for instance, by Immanuel Kant. But anything that transcends matter, that's what we mean by transcendental at this stage only. Okay? So, when we think about ourselves, can we claim that we are just one thing, where mind and body are one thing, or are those things separate? And if they are separate, do they meet somewhere? That was the old discussion that Descartes had about the pineal gland, the seat of the soul, very often referred to as, which, from a neurological standpoint, talking about soul might be a little too extreme, maybe too much on the fringes, but from an endocrine and neurological perspective, it is a gland after all, so it could make sense. But in any case, are we our mind or are we our brain? And is our brain enough to define our body, or should we include the whole of our body in this discussion? And this is, of course, the field of embodied cognition, a field within applied philosophy, we could say, that claims that our body has its own ability to understand the world, its own language to understand the world. So to limit our body to biomechanical components, sensations and feelings that are simply controlled in the best case scenario, or non-existence and just manifested outwardly by the brain, it's a very different perspective to take. So if we think about mind and matter, the first question that we have to ask ourselves is, who's in charge? If I'm talking about myself, in my case, my name is David, or David. Who's David? Is it my mind? And by mind, do I mean my psychological processes, maybe my memory, my sensation, or is it my brain? And therefore, my sensation are only to be understood in terms of their neurological function or neuroendocrinological function, if we talk about neurotransmitters and hormones. And this is a huge question. It's a very profound question, because it has a lot of repercussions, not just in the field of medicine and science, but also in fields that might apparently be distant, such as the legal component of this question. If I am my brain, and therefore I do not have a full control on it, because the very concept of I makes really no sense, or close to no sense at all, because the brain has its own meaning, might be too strong a word, but its own capacity to control things for which I'm not present as a self. Then how can I be taken accountable if some of my actions are not correct, for instance, in the best case scenario, effective in the best case scenario, or from a legal standpoint, inappropriate, as in unethical or immoral? And if those actions are deemed to be immoral and unethical, who's the judge? Where does the moral component come from? Is morality in itself a product, or according to some, a byproduct of matter? And by matter, usually we think about evolutionary biology. Well, in the introduction in textbook, some of this is summarized with an equation. So I encourage you to go on page 8, and you can see here the big M, the capital M, that stands for matter. Again, no bias here. Just sheer alphabetical order, and the small m as in mind. So in the first case, you can see big M is bigger than smaller m. So in this context here, you can see that there is matter over mind, and in the second case, the opposite, okay? Mind over matter, okay? So, what is matter, as usually they say? Never mind, right? And what is mind? It doesn't matter. That's the usual joke that very often is associated with the mind-body problem. And then below this basic statement, you can see the intrinsic difference between being equivalent and equal, okay? Can we claim that the equivalency between mind and matter is the same as equality between mind and matter? Well, of course, we are talking about two different mathematical categories here. And so below you'll see that the following equations are illogical, not logically possible. But of course, it's a very complex topic to discuss, because we will have to define what the intrinsic differences in mathematical terms are between equality and equivalency in this very context, because again, we're not comparing two different systems. We're talking about two different systems that in themselves are understood from the very entity that is utilizing them, namely us, human beings. So again, this is an important topic that it can be difficult to analyze, and it is important to review the main parameters according to which the topic is understood. But let's move on to the next part. And here we stress an important point, also from a very neuroanatomical perspective. Now, in the next few weeks, we will have the chance to visually dissect the human brain in order to better understand neurology in terms of its function and anatomical structure. But just think about the usual comparison between the prefrontal cortex, or in general cortical areas, and the limbic system. Very often the higher functioning, the more refined functioning areas of the brain are referred in traditional neuroscience with terms such as the new man of the spirit, as opposed to the old man of the flesh, where of course man means a human being in general, from the German Mensch, not man, and spirit means higher function, spirit as in rationality, in higher intellect, an intellect that separates human beings, this is the claim, from other animals, including other mammals, as opposed again to the old man of the flesh, from a developmental standpoint, because the limbic system, the central part of the brain, develops first, and the very last part of the brain to develop, we know this based on several studies, is of course a specific cortical structure, particularly the prefrontal cortex. So this will be the new man of the spirit as opposed to the old man of the flesh. Flesh also in the animalesque sense, you could say, more instinctual sense, the sense of senses, of course, and the sense of more primitive perspective. Primitive because it's primordial, it's prime, it's the first to be developed, but also primitive because it lays beyond the refined notion of cortical activation. Now, some psychologists will claim that in this debate, in this dualistic component, in this connection between inner and outer, between limbic system and prefrontal cortex, lies a whole psychoanalytic framework, the separation between our sense of awareness and, of course, all the Freudian, post-Freudian, and even Jungian differentiation between parts of self. Think about ego, superego, and id, would have, in this sense, a fully neural underpinning, a fully neurological basis. So it would be less about philosophical speculation or even spiritual, or in the case of Freud, anti-spiritual speculation, but will just be predicated upon neurological function. Okay? So to continue, this sense will have to do with our capacity to evolve as species, our capacity to become something other than ourselves. So we started from understanding ourselves through the eyes of the other person, can better understand ourselves because we see another person, but also we become a different version of ourselves. Now, notice that this is the central concept in neuroscience applied to psychotherapy. The general assumption is this: regardless, or even because of our neurological background, because of our genetic makeup, understanding our thoughts by virtue of talk therapy, for instance, will allow our well-being to be better manifested. Okay? So we can change if we can change our thoughts, and we can only change our thoughts if we do understand our thoughts. So there is a process of becoming different in ourselves. So this is what the text means by, in this context, though, we also want to stress the idea of possible comparison between old man being as opposed or different than modern man becoming. So in this context, again, man in the concept, in the sense of mensch, so human being, not male subject. Old as in traditional, and traditional not as in conservative in a political sense, but traditional as in continuously progressing, manifested, talked about, okay? The oral tradition, the sequence, okay? As opposed to the modern man, that is the man that becomes, okay? I always like to stress the importance of words in this sense. So we start from this existentialist, postmodernist perspective, where there is a clash, we could say, or at least a comparison between existence and essence, where existence is what we make out of it. We are, in other words, creators of our own destiny, as opposed to essence in a strong philosophical sense, in an ontological sense, that is the innermost fundamental basis of who we are. So existence versus essence. But also on the other perspective, the difference between being, the element of being, and the element of becoming. This is what our brains are meant to do, by the way. Think about, in developmental comparative sense, how different we are in comparison to other animals. Now, I always like to stress that from a mechanistic, we could say, standpoint, and to some extent, barely quantitative standpoint, we certainly have much more in common with other animals that sometimes we like to admit, especially with mammals. But then there are things that really separate us. We will see how that plays a role when we indeed will discuss the prefrontal cortex and other areas of the brain that are representing the neural underpinnings of language, for instance, something that really separates us, not in terms of sheer communication, because we could argue that animals do just that, but in terms of depth of structure and syntax and grammar and function, and so on and so forth, but also in a sheer developmental sense. When we are born as human beings, we are fully incapable of survival. We need the support of our primary caregiver, or our parents. And this is both a weakness, again, in a comparative sense, as well as a strength. What is the weakness? Well, the weakness is simply we are not as strong. We are not fit for survival at that point. If you look at a horse, it doesn't take much for a young subject to become fully independent. This is true for many other species. For us, of course, if we were left to our own device as newborn children, we will not be able to do that. We'll not be able to ambulate properly. We'll get injured very easily. But in comparison to that, because our brain is so malleable, from a neurological standpoint, there is no limit for continuous discovery and self-discovery. Our brain has this capacity to ever learn. Now, this is not, of course, true for every single element in our brain. We will see that the usual cutoff, that it's debatable among neuroscientists whether the cutoff is really 21, it goes up to 22 and a half, or there are more or less differentiation between biological male and biological female subject who develops that part first or not. But the prefrontal cortex is one of such areas in the brain that is very often utilized to decide, well, your brain is, at least from a macrostructural standpoint, complete. From now on, you only add content to it, but the main structures are already there. We'll see if this is the truth or not. But in any case, our brain has an infinite capacity for learning, something that, in comparison, many animals do not possess based on our current knowledge. So let's continue with this concept of being and becoming, okay? Becoming a better version of ourselves, which is also part of the main focus of this course. Now, since this course presents a variety of directions, some of which might be strongly focused on evidence-based science, laboratory science, so neurology, neuroscience based on the lab, but many others have more of a philosophical, anthropological, sociological, and even mystical, transcendental component. It is appropriate to at least go over the main subfields of neuroscience. Now, there are so many of them, and of course, for each subfield, you probably can name 10 more subfields. There are many subfolders in each of them. So, in order to present such a complex and vast material in the most possibly rational sense, the course will follow the textbook, which in turn follows a simple alphabetical order to present each of these subfields, namely affective neuroscience, artificial intelligence, behavioral neuroscience, cellular and molecular neuroscience, clinical and medical neuroscience, critical neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, computational neuroscience, cultural and transcultural neuroscience, cultural, cross-cultural and transcultural psychiatry, so a related field, developmental neuroscience, ethnopsychology and psychological anthropology, evolutionary neuroscience, history of neuroimaging, medical anthropology and ethnomedicine, neuroanatomy, neuroanthropology, neurocritical care or neurointensive care, neuroeconomics, neuroengineering, neuroethology, neuroheuristics or neuristics, neuroimaging and neurophysics, neuroinformatics, neurolinguistics, neurophysiology, neuropsychology and neuropsychotherapy, neurosurgery and neurology, including behavioral neurology, neurotheology and psychology of religion, paleoneurology, psychoneuroimmunology, psychopharmacology and psychobiology, sensory neuroscience and perception, including theory of perception, social neuroscience, sociobiology, and system neuroscience. Now, those are just the overall topics, of course, and you might argue that some of these topics are repetitive, as in you utilize two different names for the same thing, for instance, neuroheuristic or neuristics, and other fields that are not technically neuro-based, semantically speaking, thinking about psychiatry, for instance, or psychotherapy, but again, since we're trying to understand how much of who we are is really quote-unquote our brain and how much we are is everything else, including speculations and mystical or spiritual awareness of mind and spirit, now it's fundamental to include such subfields because those fields will be the clinical application of everything we will discuss in this course. Same thing for fields such as philosophy of religion or psychology of religion. The issue here is always a tendency to explain away something that is very, very complex, and I want to admit my bias right away. My training as a scientist makes me more prone to dissect and analyze topics in a somewhat visceral, even cynical sense to make sure that I'm not missing anything, I'm not over-interpreting or reading too much between the lines, or even being victim of confirmation bias when I discuss such different topics. But by admitting everybody's bias up front, we are more prone to understand how to construct a criticism that will really take into account all perspective without discarding something that might not have met the eye right away. All right, so to continue our discussion, this course takes on a very critical approach to science in general, but again, I want to defend this perspective against some more extreme postmodernist ideas here. We do certainly believe that science has a lot of answers for us. We do believe that there is a validity in the scientific method, and by we, of course, I think about myself, but also all the other authors and scientists that will be quoted as part of this course. But in the context of assuming, rightfully so, the validity of the scientific method in science, we will also analyze how much of certain elements within perceptual modalities will play a role. So let's think about science as in the epistemological sense. I mention this all the time. If you think about science as knowledge, you think about Aristotle, you think about the three types of knowledge, and those three types of knowledge, as usual, are episteme, there are techne, and of course there is the gnostic element, the element that defines science as knowledge in itself, right? And I have a whole video dedicated to the three parts of knowledge of Socrates, including the third one, which of course is phronesis, this prudence. But aside from prudence, which you could say has to do with ethics, especially biomedical ethics, and techne, which is the technological application, or rather the application of technology in the context of science, which should not be confused with science in itself. The third one is science as knowledge, really. So the epistemological sense, the study of science, that's what epistemology is. And if you think about methodology within epistemology, we had to think about the acquisition, the attainability, and the validity of such knowledge, which is also understanding, so also reading between the lines is the core of intelligence, reading between, as well as comprehension and realization, is also evidenced in many other philosophical perspectives. For instance, in German philosophy, the equivalent is Erkenntnistheorie and Gnoseologie as synonyms for epistemology. So a theory of recognition, recognizing, Erkenntnis, a type of knowledge that recognizes itself in the process. Okay, it's a process of recollection, we could also say. In this sense, I will really recommend students to review some of the biggest names in this sense, starting from Hegel, some Marxist and post-Marxist philosophy, but also Heidegger, Franz Brentano, Karl Jasper, and so on and so forth. We will therefore apply many of the concepts using classical epistemology, as well as the one presented by criticism, to the core of epistemology, whether from philosophical skepticism or from general postmodernism. Wonderful. Again, thank you very much. This concludes the first week of Critical Neuroscience, the Mind-Body Connection. Please check out the module with all its content and assignment, and I will see you all next week. Bye-bye.